She had millions in her bank account, a mansion in the English countryside, and absolutely no reason to smile on a Tuesday afternoon. Until the day she found strangers crying at her daughter's grave, and everything she thought she knew about grief, love, and family changed forever. Stay with me until the end of this story, because the twist in the middle will completely change how you see kindness. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The English countryside in autumn has a way of making loneliness feel even heavier. The trees lose their leaves quietly. The sky turns that soft, gray color that doesn't quite rain but never fully clears. And if you're already carrying grief in your chest, the season seems to know, and it leans in. Eleanor Whitmore knew that feeling better than anyone. At 62, she had a mansion outside Bath with 14 rooms she never used. She had accounts her financial advisor managed, so she wouldn't have to think about the numbers. She had staff who kept the house running like clockwork. What she did not have, what no amount of money could ever give back to her, was her daughter. Clara had been gone for 3 years. A road accident on a wet November evening. A phone call that changed everything. And then the particular cruelty of grief that nobody warns you about. Life just continues. The world keeps moving. And you're standing still, holding a name in your mouth that nobody around you says anymore. Every Tuesday at exactly 3 o'clock, Eleanor drove herself to St. Hilda's Cemetery on the edge of town. She always came alone. She always wore her good coat. Clara used to say she dressed too formally for a Tuesday, and somehow, dressing up felt like keeping a small promise. She knew every stone on that path, every turn, every tree, which is why, on this particular Tuesday, she stopped the moment she turned the corner toward Clara's grave. There was someone there. A man in a maintenance worker's uniform, worn jacket, scuffed boots, was kneeling at her daughter's headstone. And beside him, pressed close to his arm, was a little girl. No older than 5. Long dark hair. A red duffel coat. Both of them crying softly. Eleanor felt something sharp move through her chest. She walked faster. Her footsteps clicked on the stone path. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice coming out harder than she intended. "What are you doing here? This is my daughter's grave." The man scrambled to his feet. Kind eyes. Tired face. Work-worn hands that immediately reached for the little girl, who buried herself against his leg at the sound of Eleanor's sharp tone. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said quickly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "We didn't mean any disrespect. We'll leave. We'll go right now." And they would have. They were already turning. But Eleanor's eyes dropped to the grave. There were wildflowers there. Simple ones, the kind you pick from a roadside, not a florist. Arranged with obvious, careful love. And beside them, held down by a small stone so the autumn wind wouldn't take it, was a child's drawing. Crayon on paper. 4 stick figures holding hands under a golden rainbow. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Wait," she said. Her voice was different now. Quieter. Stripped of its armor. "Please. I want to understand." She looked at the man, then at the little girl still hiding behind his leg. "How did you know my daughter?" The man hesitated. He looked down at the child, then back at Eleanor. And when he finally spoke, he said Clara's name, not carefully, not awkwardly the way strangers sometimes did, but with the quiet weight of someone who had said it in prayer before. And that was the moment Eleanor Whitmore's carefully held composure came completely undone. Because grief, she had learned, is a lonely room. But someone else remembering your person, really remembering them, that is the sound of a door opening. "Come," Eleanor said softly, gesturing toward a nearby bench. "Please, sit with me. There is a particular kind of pain that has no name. It's not the sharp pain of fresh loss. It's something quieter. It's the moment you realize that the person you loved had an entire world inside them, a world of choices and sacrifices and small acts of grace. And you never knew. You never got to tell them that you saw it, that you were proud." Eleanor would feel that pain deeply before this conversation was over. The man's name was Reuben Adler. The little girl pressed against his side was his daughter, Lottie. He spoke carefully at first, like someone who wasn't sure he had the right to be sitting on this bench, in this cemetery, in front of this woman. But Eleanor leaned forward, hands folded in her lap, and she listened the way you listen when every word matters. "I work maintenance at St. Anne's Hospital in Bristol," Reuben began. "About 4 years ago, my wife Petra was diagnosed with cancer. Terminal. We had no family nearby. No savings to speak of. I was working nights at the hospital just to cover the bills, And even then it wasn't enough. Eleanor said nothing. She watched his face. Clara was Petra's nurse, he continued, his voice dropping. But she was so much more than that. She would finish her shift and just stay. She'd pull a chair beside Petra's bed and talk to her. About nothing important. About everything. She made Petra laugh on days when laughing seemed impossible. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could see it perfectly. Clara in her nurse's uniform, still in the room long after her hours ended, refusing to let someone face the dark alone. She had always been like that. Even as a child, she was the one who stayed. When Petra got too weak to talk, Reuben said, Clara would read to her. She brought books from home. She'd sit there reading out loud, holding Petra's hand. My wife used to say that Clara's voice made the pain feel further away. The autumn wind moved through the trees above them. Lottie sat perfectly still on her father's lap, listening to a story she clearly already knew by heart. And then Reuben paused. He glanced down at Lottie, then back at Eleanor. And something shifted in his expression, something that looked like it had been carried quietly for a very long time. There's something else, he said. Something I don't think you know. Eleanor looked at him. I was working night shifts, and I couldn't afford childcare for Lottie. So I used to bring her to the hospital and leave her in the waiting room with a blanket and some crackers while I worked. She was 4 years old, sitting alone in a corridor at 2 a.m. Eleanor's hand moved to her mouth. Clara found out. His voice broke slightly on the words. She never made a fuss about it. She never reported it or judged me. She just started staying later on the nights I worked. She'd sit with Lottie in that waiting room for hours. She brought toys from home. Books. Paper and crayons. She taught Lottie how to draw. Lottie, who had been quiet until this moment, reached into the small bag beside her and pulled out a worn, threadbare stuffed rabbit. Miss Clara gave me Benny, she said solemnly, holding the rabbit up for Eleanor to see. She said whenever I missed my mummy, I should hug Benny and remember that love doesn't go away. It just changes shape. The words landed somewhere deep inside Eleanor's chest and stayed there. Because she remembered now. After Clara's accident, when Eleanor had gone to her daughter's flat to collect her things, she had found boxes. Boxes of children's books. Toys. Coloring pencils. A bag of craft supplies. At the time, she had quietly assumed it was for a friend's child, or perhaps something Clara had been meaning to donate. She had never asked. She had packed the boxes away without understanding what she was holding. Evidence of a love so quiet it left no noise, only traces. Petra passed away in November, Reuben said. And 2 weeks later, he stopped. Steadied himself. 2 weeks later, we heard about Clara. Lottie and I lost them both within the same month. The three of them sat in silence for a long moment. A grief shared between strangers who, it turned out, were not strangers at all. They were the people Clara had loved. Just in different rooms of her life, rooms she had never thought to connect. We had no place to go to say goodbye properly, Reuben said quietly. We weren't sure we'd be welcome at the funeral. So we started coming here. Early mornings before my shift. Lottie brings drawings. I bring whatever flowers we can manage. He looked at Eleanor steadily. We just needed somewhere to thank her. Eleanor looked at this man. This tired, decent, quietly dignified man who had lost everything and still found his way to a grave with wildflowers. And she felt something she had not felt in 3 years. She did not feel alone. She felt, for the first time, like she was exactly where Clara had always intended her to be. I'm sorry, Eleanor said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry I spoke to you harshly when I arrived. I'm sorry it took me this long to find you. Reuben shook his head gently. You have nothing to be sorry for. A long pause. Would you and Lottie, Eleanor began carefully, like to come for tea this week? I have albums full of photographs of Clara when she was young. And I believe, her voice caught, I believe she would have wanted us to know each other. Reuben looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. And Lottie looked up at Eleanor with wide, searching eyes and said very quietly, Do you have pictures of Miss Clara when she was little like me? I have hundreds, Eleanor whispered. And for the first time in 3 years, standing in a cemetery on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor Whitmore smiled. There is something nobody tells you about grief. They tell you it comes in waves. They tell you time heals. They tell you to lean on people, to talk about it, to let yourself feel it. And all of that is true in its own way. But nobody tells you about the specific loneliness of grieving someone whose goodness was bigger than you ever fully knew. Nobody prepares you for the moment you realize that the person you lost was quietly changing the world in ways they never once mentioned at dinner, never brought up on a Sunday phone call, never asked for a single word of recognition for. Nobody tells you that discovering that, really discovering it, can break you open all over again. But this time, the breaking feels different. This time, something comes in through the cracks. Eleanor had lived alone in that 14-room house for 3 years. She had eaten her meals at one end of a long dining table designed for a family. She had walked past Clara's childhood bedroom every single morning without opening the door. She had kept the house immaculate, kept her schedule disciplined, kept herself composed in public, because composure, she had learned long ago, was the armor that wealth and upbringing gave you. You wore it even when there was nothing underneath worth protecting anymore. But the Tuesday after she met Reuben and Lottie, Eleanor found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She went into Clara's childhood bedroom. She opened the curtains. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pulled out the old photograph albums from the shelf and laid them open across the floral duvet. And she did not cry. She looked. She remembered. She prepared. Because in 4 days, a little girl with dark hair and a red duffel coat was coming to tea. And she wanted to be ready to share her daughter with someone who already loved her. That Thursday, Reuben and Lottie arrived at Eleanor's home for the first time. Lottie stood at the front gate and stared up at the house with enormous eyes. "Daddy," she whispered loudly, "is this a castle?" Reuben looked mortified. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that surprises you by arriving before you've given it permission. She hadn't heard that sound come out of herself in a very long time. "It's just a house," Eleanor said, kneeling down to Lottie's level. "A very quiet one. It could use some noise, actually." Lottie considered this seriously. Then she walked through the gate like she owned the place. And just like that, the house was different. Tea became a ritual. Every Tuesday, after the cemetery, the three of them would walk back to Eleanor's home. Eleanor would make tea and set out biscuits, and Lottie would immediately migrate to the sitting room floor with her crayons while the adults talked. Reuben shared stories of Clara at the hospital, small moments, funny ones, tender ones. The time Clara had smuggled a patient's dog in under her coat because the man was dying and hadn't seen his dog in 3 months. The way she used to hum quietly while she worked, completely unaware she was doing it. How she once spent her lunch break helping a confused elderly patient write a letter to his estranged son because, as Clara put it, somebody has to. Eleanor shared stories too. Clara at 7, insisting on rescuing every snail from the garden path after rainfall, relocating them one by one to the flower bed with a teaspoon. Clara at 15, secretly tutoring a classmate who was failing her exams, never telling anyone, never asking for anything in return. Clara at 22, on her first day of nursing training, ringing home not to talk about herself, but to ask if the elderly neighbor next door had been looked in on lately. "She was always like that," Eleanor said softly one evening, cradling her teacup. "From the very beginning. She never thought about herself first. I used to worry about her for it. I used to think the world would take advantage of someone like her." Reuben was quiet for a moment. "The world did take her," he said gently. "But not the way you feared. She chose every single thing she gave. Nobody took anything from Clara. She decided. Every time." Eleanor looked at him across the table. And something she had been carrying for 3 years, a low, quiet guilt that perhaps she hadn't appreciated her daughter enough, hadn't said it enough, hadn't understood the size of who Clara was while Clara was still there to hear it. That something loosened, just slightly, and began to fall away. The weeks turned into months. Lottie began to draw Clara from the photographs, crayon versions of a real woman, golden-haired and smiling, surrounded by patients and rainbows and rabbits named Benny. She would present each drawing to Eleanor with solemn ceremony, and Eleanor would add it to a growing collection she kept in a folder on the sitting room shelf, next to the photograph albums. Reuben, quietly and without being asked, began helping with things around the estate. A gate hinge that had been stiff for months. A section of garden wall that needed repointing. Small things done carefully, done well. Eleanor tried to pay him, and he refused every time. "You're giving Lottie something I can't give her," he said simply. "We're square." One afternoon, Eleanor sat down with her solicitor and set up an education fund in Clara's name, designated for Lottie's schooling, all the way through to university if she wanted it. She didn't tell Reuben in advance. She simply handed him the letter one Tuesday evening after tea, matter-of-factly, the way you hand someone something that was always theirs. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat against it, the way people do when they need something solid to hold on to. "This is too much," he said. "It's not charity," Eleanor said firmly. "It's what Clara would have done. I'm just finishing what she started." Reuben looked up at her. His eyes were bright. He didn't argue again. Lottie started calling her grandma Ellie sometime in December. Not as a decision, not as a conversation. She simply said it one afternoon as naturally as breathing, the way children adopt things when they feel true, and nobody in the room corrected her. And that was that. Eleanor's house, for the first time in 3 years, smelled like biscuits on Tuesdays. There were crayon drawings on the refrigerator. There was a child's pair of red Wellington boots by the back door for muddy garden days. There was noise. There was laughter. There was the particular, irreplaceable sound of a small person running down a hallway for no reason at all. The 14 rooms were still there. But they were no longer empty in the way that had mattered. 6 months after that first Tuesday, 6 months after Eleanor had walked sharply toward a stranger at her daughter's grave and demanded to know what he was doing there, the three of them stood together at St. Hilda's Cemetery in the pale winter light. Lottie knelt down and placed her newest drawing carefully against the headstone, smoothing the corners with both hands so the wind wouldn't take it. Eleanor leaned in to look. It showed 4 figures. 2 at the top floating in soft gold clouds, one with a nurse's uniform and yellow hair, one with dark curls and a gentle smile. Petra and Clara, together somewhere above. And below them, on green ground, 2 figures standing side by side, their hands joined, a tall man and a gray-haired woman. And between them, a small girl with her arms stretched wide, touching both of them at once. Connecting them, a single golden thread ran from the figures below all the way up to the figures in the clouds. Unbroken. Continuous. Lottie stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and slipped one hand into her father's and one hand into Eleanor's without a word, as if this was simply where her hands belonged. Eleanor looked at the headstone for a long, quiet moment. "Thank you, Clara," she whispered. "I came here every Tuesday looking for you. I didn't realize you'd already left someone here for me to find." The winter sun came out from behind a cloud, briefly, gently, the way it sometimes does in England when you least expect it. And Eleanor Whitmore, the wealthiest woman in the county, the woman who had everything except what mattered, stood in a cemetery with a maintenance worker and a 6-year-old girl who called her grandma, and understood fully, for the very first time, what her daughter had always known. That kindness is never wasted. That love does not end at death. It redirects. It finds new hands to move through, new hearts to land in, new forms it was always going to take. Clara had not simply been a nurse. She had been a builder. She had been quietly, faithfully constructing something: connections, trust, safety, warmth, brick by brick, shift by shift, crayon drawing by crayon drawing, and she had done it without a single thought for whether anyone was watching. Nobody was watching. That was the whole point. The greatest acts of kindness in this world are the ones that happen in waiting rooms at 2 a.m, in hospital corridors after a shift has ended, beside the beds of people who are frightened and in pain, in the small, invisible spaces where one person decides, without applause, without recognition, without even telling their own mother, that another human being deserves to feel less alone tonight. Clara had known something that most of us spend our whole lives trying to learn: that you don't need a reason to be kind. You don't need a reward waiting at the other end, or a guarantee that anyone will notice, or even the comfort of knowing that the people you love will find out what you did after you're gone. You just need to see someone who needs something, and decide that you are the person who is going to give it. That's all. That is the whole thing. And here is what I want to leave you with today, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. Eleanor almost walked away that Tuesday. She almost let her grief and her pride and her sharpness send Reuben and Lottie back out through those cemetery gates before a single word had passed between them. She almost went home to her empty house, to her quiet table, to her 14 rooms, alone as usual, as always. One pause changed everything. One moment of choosing curiosity over defensiveness. One softened word: wait. That's how thin the line is between a life that stays closed and a life that opens back up. We all have our version of that gate. That sharp word we almost say. That stranger we almost don't speak to. That Tuesday we almost skip. That small, ordinary moment where the rest of our life is quietly waiting on the other side if only we choose to step through. Clara spent her whole life stepping through those moments. And in the end, she didn't just change the lives of the people she helped. She changed the life of the mother she left behind by leaving behind the right people for her to find. That is a legacy. Not marble. Not money. Not a name on a building. People. Changed quietly forever by one woman who simply decided every single day to be kind. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've been carrying grief alone, or sitting in an empty house, or walking a path that feels like it only leads to more sadness, I hope this reminds you that grace has a way of arriving when you least expect it. Sometimes it comes in the form of wildflowers left by a stranger. Sometimes it comes in the form of a child's drawing. And sometimes it comes in the form of a small hand slipping into yours, reminding you, quietly and without words, that you were never as alone as you thought. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.